So hello everyone, welcome to day 3 of DC Startup Week. We're in the midst of the whole 5-day conference and event. We have a jam-packed day full of educational sessions, content, and networking opportunities. My name is Rachel Koretsky. I am one of the organizers of DC Startup Week, as well as a founder of a tech startup, UPace. I'm so excited today to have Professor Bellows here, who's a professor at American University's School of Business, and as well as the head of the American University Incubator Program. Professor Bellows was one of the 2 professors who encouraged me to pursue entrepreneurship and start my business, UPace, which was almost 6 years ago, which is insane. So I am so excited and so proud to have Professor Bellows here with us today. So with that, please welcome me in joining Professor Bellows to the DC Startup Week stage.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate that. It's been an amazing journey watching you succeed over these years, going through some of the processes we're going to talk about a little bit today. It's nice to see some former students. Hello, Russell, involved here today. Let me jump right into some slides in the interest of time and encourage you to ask questions along the way. Rachel, is someone managing the chat room separately, or should I keep an eye on that?
I'll keep an eye on the chat and I'll let you know if any questions come through.
Yeah, just feel free to interrupt me. There we go. So again, thank you for joining me, and thank you, Rachel, for having me here. It's a real honor to be part of this. It's an exciting event in the district every year and in the region, and I think one that's influence is growing considerably. We get really excited about it every year at AU. Normally we host an event on campus, and so we're doing the best we can via Zoom this year, like the rest of you. Just by way of background, my background is more toward entrepreneurship. I spent a number of years out in Silicon Valley, probably almost 20 years, building a company that did a lot of consulting to early stage startups. After I spent about 5 years at IBM and realizing that the corporate world wasn't exactly for me. And I worked with a lot of startups that actually evolved from being startups to being fairly large companies. And so the benefit of that was watching entrepreneurs and founders on their journey, watching them go through, the ups and downs, the frustrations, watching lots of companies fail and seeing lots of companies succeed, and trying to kind of discern the difference. I was able to have a successful exit of my company after we built it to a global firm in 1999. It was acquired by a big New York firm called Omnicom. My taste for entrepreneurship hadn't waned, but I spent a little time in sort of more established early stage companies, Simplexity, Red Creek, Veritech, and then went back into a mobile startup called One White Pixel, where we developed some early mobile apps for the World Bank, for some European healthcare agencies, and a surfing app, and I've never surfed in my life. Luckily, my partners had. And then I got into teaching entrepreneurship by request, and started teaching actually first at the University of Maryland in the engineering school, and then began teaching at AU. About 7 years ago, I've been involved in the National Science Foundation I-Corps program, both as a participant and as a mentor in our AU site program. I've worked a lot with an organization some of you may know called FedTech, which makes federal technologies available to entrepreneurs. And through our work on campus, we work with the Collegiate Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a national organization for student startups. And I've done some guest lecturing at other schools, Berkeley and George Mason and Menlo College out in California. So that's by way of saying I'm really old. So you would expect that I've done a few things in my life. So just to, again, set the stage, my background is largely in the entrepreneurial side. about 4 years ago, I participated in a design thinking project that American University was doing, and it was run by a great group, some of you may know, in Washington, called the Education Design Lab, which applies design thinking to what's going on and how in collegiate education, what's changing, how is it evolving. And they've done amazing work. They work with over 100 universities, and their ideas are both compelling and a little scary to traditional universities. And I was just sort of impressed by the collaboration, by the creativity that happened in that process. And I also had an opportunity to work with another early stage design thinking company in the area called Digital Fast Forward, which actually came out of our incubator. It was started by a gentleman named Clay Richardson, who had worked for Forrester Research for a number of years, was impressed with design thinking, and decided, how do we build that to enable corporations to get more adept at the innovation process. And so I've done some work with them as well. By no means am I a Stanford D School type of design thinking person, but I have observed it a little bit. And in fact, I've observed it to the point that I was asked to teach an intro class, which is a little scary, but they say you never know how much you know about something until you teach it. So that was sort of my introduction, and I've done quite a bit of research over the years. So with that, I'm going to try to put this into some perspective, and I'm going to borrow largely on some work by Steve Blank. Many of you might know Steve Blank from his work in customer discovery and customer development. And I'm going to focus on this concept of design thinking and customer discovery, which I'll be loose in my terminology, but are both frameworks that we use and apply at various stages in companies. And my thesis, which aligns with what others have said, is that they're for two different types of scenarios, and there's an opportunity to perhaps merge them into sort of a continuous process, and that's where I'll end up today. So if I might ask, how many of you has actively used one or the other framework, either customer development or design thinking in your startup? And you can just do that by way of chat if you'd like. I'm seeing an empty chat room.
I'm seeing one said neither, another one said one. Briefly during your class from Russell.
Okay. Well, we won't belabor it, but it just helps me understand where we're at. So I'm going to assume that the answer to the next question is the same, right? Very few have used both. And that's the part I want to get to today. Is there a way to use both? Why and how would we do that? And so the question I get frequently, both from students, and Russell was probably one of them, as well as from entrepreneurs in our incubator and other entrepreneurs I've met, is I hear a lot about both this concept of design thinking and this concept of customer development, but when do I use one versus the other? How do they fit together? Do they conflict or do they align? And so that's sort of my agenda. I want to talk about each method for those of you who haven't been directly involved with it. I'd like to look at where they have some commonalities, where they diverge. I'd like to look at how they complement each other to help us, and then break into a discussion to answer any questions I can for you. So here's the very basic question. When I went to the National Science Foundation for the I-Corps program, first question they ask, and first question Steve Blank asks in his customer development methodology, which is, what's the number one reason most businesses fail? Anybody want to unmute and give me an answer? What is the number one reason most companies fail? Russell, this is a quiz. Let's see how well you remember. Okay, the number one reason isn't finance, it isn't competition, it isn't management. It's because they build things people don't want to buy. So that in itself is sort of a daunting thought, right? We're going to invest mostly time as a startup. And we need to kind of look at this equation. If business is about building something people want to buy, what do they want to buy? And how do we find that out? And then what do we build? And how do we build it so that we can kind of make that equation work for us and avoid this issue of companies failing because they missed what their target customers want. And so the impact of this is sort of interesting when you think about just that simple statement and the evolution of some of these frameworks. When I was in Silicon Valley, startups and venture capital and the entrepreneurial ecosystem was driven by technical ideas. If you had a double E from Stanford, if you went to MIT, if you were a graduate of Hewlett-Packard, you had a great idea, wrote an extensive business plan of about 100 pages so that when you put it on someone's desk, it had what we used to call the thud effect, which actually was a completely meaningless piece of garbage because nobody could predict 4 or 5 years into the future with any accuracy, but it was all we had. And you went down Sand Hill Road and you talked to some of the major venture capital firms. And if your pedigree was right, if they had somebody on in their company or a former entrepreneur who they had funded who could validate your ideas, you got a check. And you got a big check early on. And the idea was, go figure it out. Right? We're going to give you lots of money, put a lot of pressure on you to make that money work, and you go figure it out. Build a product, find a market, or fail. And unfortunately, too many of them failed. There were a few successes, obviously, but the majority of them failed. That's why venture capital firms establish this portfolio concept that 1 out of 10 investments will cover the cost of the other 9 that either fail or break even. And so in the mid 2000s, around 2008, 2009, Steve Blank, a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley himself, began to look at this model and say, it doesn't work. And so he began to create what was called the customer development or customer discovery model, which evolved into the lean startup, which was created by Eric Ries, who was a student of his in class. And what it does is it puts the pressure on the startup and on the venture and on the founders to figure out what customers want before they get funding. So you work off sweat equity, you work off friends and family funding, you figure out what customer segment am I targeting, what's my hypothesis about what their problem is, how do I go find those people, how do I test it, how do I build a really ugly, rough version, how do I get that to market, how do I measure the progress, how do I learn from that, how do I eventually find the market fit, and how do I get to revenue? And along the way, various stages of investment capital come to you if you're successful. The first part is about building a business model. The second part is about building a business plan. So we've gone from a business plan, which is fictitious, that drives everything, to a business model which acknowledges that we're searching for this, we don't know it yet, and then evolving into a more formal business plan when we're ready. Much more logical, much more beneficial to the founder because it doesn't put undue pressure on them. It gives them the chance to experiment, and much more friendly to the investor who is getting a company and looking at companies that have already begun to talk to their customers. And so 2 amazing methodologies evolved to this, and they both get us to compelling events, but the question becomes, when do I use one versus the other? And this is the essence of the business, of the customer discovery, customer development program that Steve Blank developed. It's called the Business Model Canvas, and many of you have probably seen it. And it says, I've got to figure out what segment I'm targeting and who has a problem. What is an urgent need that that segment has that is either not fulfilled or not fulfilled well? And if I can figure that out with a solution that solves their problem, that's my value proposition. So what benefit am I bringing to a segment of customers that have an urgent need? And when I do that, I divide this model into revenue streams, which is everything to the right of my dotted pink line, and costs, which is everything to the left of that line. And I fill in each of these 9 boxes, especially the top 7, with my hypotheses for each one. And I go out and I start to test each one through an interview process. I interview customers, I interview potential strategic partners, distribution partners, and I begin to validate or invalidate my hypotheses, right? And I go through that process, and each time what I'm doing is refining and tightening a business model. But I'm not forced into dictating to an investor, this is the exact way it's going to be, let's lock and load and fund me, right? I have the freedom and the flexibility to be wrong, to fail, to make mistakes, and then to make corrections along the way. And this is based largely because it came from Silicon Valley on a technology model. I have a technology product, who do I sell it to? But it's applicable in many ways to non-technology products as well, because the premise is figuring out a problem that people have and how do I solve it? It may not be as visible if you're in the restaurant business or maybe the fashion business, but it still is a model that works by spending time with customers. And this is sort of the way Blank described it, right? We have this framework where I'm trying to find customers who have a problem. And if I find out that my hypothesis is wrong, I pivot. I either pivot my market segment and focus my solution on a different market segment, or I pivot my product and I focus my product on a different market segment. Or I change my product. And along the way, I'm making these course corrections through interviewing and getting out into the marketplace, finding the reaction to my idea, and building something that the customers are telling me that they're interested in, as opposed to me jumping to a solution that I presume they're going to want. And once I finish that and I've refined that, then I decide, do I have an executable business plan? Right? And in which case, I begin to start to really develop customers and build my company. But if I don't, I go back and I keep pivoting until I find something, or I give up and I quit or switch to another business, right? So that's the framework for customer discovery, customer development. The framework for design thinking is slightly different. We start with a very deep understanding of a group of people. And design thinking actually borrows this part of it from sociology, where it's called ethnographic research. You immerse yourself in a group of people to find out what their needs and problems are. You observe them, you interview them, you spend time really deeply understanding their problem from their point of view, not from your point of view, not with your bias, not with any thought about what you want to build, but who are these people? What do they need? What do they want? And then we go to the stage of defining the problem, brainstorming solutions. So this is where the solution comes, whereas in the other model, we start with the solution, and then we test it. And then we go from here, from our ideas to prototyping and testing, a loop, which is very similar to the customer development model. I build rough, ugly, rapid prototypes. I test it, I refine it, I test it, I refine it, until, again, I'm building what the customer tells me they want. And this is a model that was developed at Stanford at the D School, and with a company called IDEO based out in Palo Alto, which actually helped fund the D School at Stanford. Okay, so those two frameworks. This framework says I need to understand customer needs and then iterate. And so there's some commonalities here, right? They're both trying to move us from uncertainty and confusion and just this mess we look at when we say, I want to start a company. Great, what do I do now? To focus. And there's a path along the way. It's not instantaneous. And the intent is the same, right? I want to get to some type of product or service that I can sell. And the approach is similar. Get out of the building and go talk to, observe, interview customers doing the things that they're doing so you can understand their problems and needs. This is the mantra of Steve Blank. Get out of the building, right? There are no facts in your building. The only facts you care about are in the marketplace. But they diverge, and it's driven by the type of organization that you are, right? The entrepreneur's dilemma is that the dashboard is constantly, those needles on the dashboard are constantly moving. How much are we spending? How long will our capital last? And the amount of cash we have in the bank dictates how much time I have to figure out my business model. So there's a sense of urgency that drives us as entrepreneurs. I have to figure this out fast before I run out of time or money. And the entrepreneur sphere is exactly that. If I run out of money, I have to go figure out how to raise capital, or I have to shut down my dream. And so the intent for you as an entrepreneur is, how do I get to market fast with enough features that I can attract early customers and innovators? I'm not building a perfect product. And this is something we constantly have to dial back with young entrepreneurs. I'm not trying to build version 3.0. I'm trying to build version 0.5. Because the only people we care about, if you look at our bell curve at the bottom, are the innovators. The 2.5% of any market that acknowledges that there's a problem and they haven't been able to solve it themselves. This is a sequential bell curve that's been tested about 5,000 times and has always been correct. So if we're trying to solve the problem for the later stages of the marketplace, we're going to try to be perfect. And perfection is not what you're trying to do. Getting something in the marketplace as fast as possible and learning from the marketplace what works and what doesn't work is our challenge. And so you as an entrepreneur are driven by a sense of urgency. You have to be biased toward getting something done, toward making measurable progress, toward getting a minimally viable product, which is an early stage product, to the customers. You have to beat the competition to that, and you've got to acquire users quickly and then start to generate revenue. But urgency is what dictates you, dictates your process, right? And let's look at the other side of this, the corporation. And I'm not necessarily talking about Fortune 100 or Fortune 1000 corporations, but more established companies, right, at various stages, from small, medium enterprises on up to larger enterprises. The question, the dilemma that they face is, have we done enough research to feel confident in making a major product investment? Do I know the customer well enough that I can say, I'm going to bring this $50 million investment in terms of product development, staff time, testing, marketing, out to the marketplace? Because if I don't know the customer well enough and the customer doesn't respond, I face this, right? Investors who are unhappy, whether that's the public market or private. And nobody wants to face that wrath. And so the corporate mindset is, I've got to create repeatable systems, repeatable products that can generate revenue and deliver a profit. Apple, every incremental version of the iPhone or the iPad is exactly that, repeatable products that generate revenue. Boy, do they generate revenue, and deliver a profit. Boy, do they deliver a profit. But they've mastered this, even though they still seem to us at times like a startup, because they're so innovative in the way they do things. So this is what the corporation wants to do. As an entrepreneur, you want to get something out there as fast as possible. As a corporation, you want to get something out there that's acceptable to a large swath of customers, that's repeatable. And so the corporate mindset is more one of caution, right? It's get the process right, get our procedures defined, establish incentives for success. Very different, a culture of urgency versus a culture of caution. And keep in mind that as startups, we want to shed our culture of urgency. We'd like to get to this model, right? That's sort of our end goal. But we have a long way to get there, and we have to be aggressive in taking on the corporate mindset in order to achieve that. And so we have to make sure we're applying the right framework to the right solution. The customer discovery, customer development model is built for speed and making decisions that are just good enough to get out to market, and we learn once we're in the marketplace. Think of a great example of this is look at the App Store, right? The reviews in an App Store. Somebody has launched an app and they're living off reviews to help them refine the next version. And you see a mixed bag of reviews. It's a very transparent process, but it's a great example of getting something to the marketplace, finding how the customers respond, and then making iterative changes to it. Design thinking is built for getting customer needs right before we make a big investment. And so these are the two innovation processes that we look at. One is built for urgency, one is built for assurance or caution. And it affects the mentality, right? The vision in design thinking is solving a problem. In customer development, it's build a business as fast as we can. The problems that we face in design thinking are large, complex problems, usually faced by corporations that have the money and the time to attack them. Customer development, it's built around tech products, but it's early stage products. The mindset in design thinking is problem discovery, and in customer development, it's get our vision, get a product ready. And our approach is in design thinking is qualitative, and customer development is quantitative. How quickly can I measure and refine my processes and my customer response? The focus in design thinking is human-centered. In customer development, traditionally from this model, it's engineering-centered and then customers. Our hypothesis in design thinking is generate and explore, and customer development is validate and experiment. Our inquiry is this open-ended ethnography. We can spend lots of time with customers, understanding them. In customer development, it's get to a problem and actionable metrics as quickly as we can. And again, in design thinking, we learn by reframing the question. In customer development, we pivot our business or our product or our market. And in design thinking, we're focused on empathy, and in customer development, we're focused on speed. So you can see there's a very different mindset based on urgency or patience to each of these frameworks. And so the question that I've been looking at is where they fit, because we teach both and they both have value. How do we get a deeper customer understanding and the clear realization of needs that come from design thinking, so that when we move forward with a product and begin our business model and customer development, customer discovery, we have a higher assurance that the customer has validated in advance what we're trying to do, or at least that our idea is generally framed by customer input. And where I've come out is, what if we took out the last two stages of the design thinking process for entrepreneurs, the prototype and test, which we go into eventually in the business model, and we use the design thinking process of empathy and defining the problem and creative solution through ideation, through brainstorming, come up with our solution, and then enter into the customer development model, right? And I've looked at about 3 or 4 other people who have approached this problem, and they all seem to come up with a similar type of approach, that if we use design thinking in advance to deeply inform ourselves about customers before we enter into anything, right? So this may be just us as a founder spending lots and lots of time with customers. We can efficiently deploy both and have a better understanding of our customers. And one of the organizations that started to define this is a company called the Gartner Group. Some of you may know they're a tech firm that does market analysis, and this is how they defined it. They said, let's start with the concept of empathy using design thinking methodology. Let's use that to define the problem we're solving. Let's brainstorm, but then let's converge around this experimentation phase, where we now go into a series of hypotheses, apply the business model canvas, those 9 quadrants or 9 boxes I showed you, and we begin building, measuring, and learning from the process, and each time refining it further. And Gartner goes on to say that there's actually a third loop that can be done by agile development. I'm not going to go into that here because that tends to weight itself more toward just software. But if we do that, what we get is in design thinking, this deeper user understanding, better definition of problems, and we're able to get to a clear understanding of who our customers are and what they need. Customer development then becomes optimized for this rapid way of testing our hypotheses, getting a rough product out to the innovators as quickly as possible, and still enabling us to refine and repeat until we really go to market and start to build a business plan. So if business is about building something people want to buy, we can't rush to solutions, but we need to understand customers and their needs. Sorry about the typo. And we still need to, once we do that, then we need to accelerate our understanding of product market fit. And so design thinking, it gives us a process for uncovering human needs, for identifying the right problem, while customer development gives us a framework for fast and systematic testing of hypotheses. And all of that leads us to what I think we all tend to sometimes forget in business, that business is about solving human problems, that business is human-centered. And that's the beauty of design thinking. It brings us back to the point that we're solving real problems for real people. And the better we do that, the more fulfilling our work is, and hopefully the more successful we are in solving those problems. So I'll leave it there. I'll get out of share mode, and perhaps we can have a conversation. Can I answer questions for people?
Feel free to put any questions on the chat. I'll give the ability for everyone to be able to unmute themselves if you just want to go off of mute to ask the question directly.
Grisel, great question. Are there examples of successful usage of a hybrid approach? I think there's a lot. I'm not sure that it's been done with intent. And I say that because I think a lot of entrepreneurs tend to dismiss design thinking as something for bigger companies at later stages, as we portrayed here. But what we've been doing in our incubator is you're not even admitted unless you've gone out and spent time with at least 20 customers, just to frame your idea, to frame your concept. And I think venture firms or early stage investment firms do this. I think boards of advisors are becoming more astute in this. In fact, we did it with Rachel in Rachel's company. Rachel hit a point early on where she was not sure which way to go. She wasn't even sure. Rachel, I hope you don't mind my explaining this.
Not at all.
About whether to go forward or not. Maybe you might want to talk about it, Rachel, how we had that conversation.
Hi, Bill.
Rachel,
Yes. Could you give me the prompt one more time?
Yeah, sure. Do you remember the conversation we had that summer when you were trying to figure out whether to move forward or not, and how you approached it and the discussion we had?
So we had many discussions, Professor, on different stages. Let me put myself back on video. I think the one summer you're talking about is, deciding about like your market fit on top of it. One thing that, I learned early on, we started working with universities and colleges as our target market for UPACE. And one of the challenges we're facing is a really long sales cycle, really hard just to get any form of money, and you need to obviously be making money from your clients to do it. So the pivot, what we kind of talked about is making is like what other industries could leverage and utilize our product. And that's where we were looking at community rec centers as a whole, and started working with YMCA, which is community centers, and government parks and recreation. So it was kind of changing that mindset. But one of the biggest things that, Professor Bellows recommended to me was talking and listening to your customers and making sure that you're kind of hearing what they want, what their needs are, what their pain points. That way you're making sure that you're building the features and functionality that they need. And most importantly, the functionality that they're willing to buy. So what I kind of learned early on was that some of my assumptions of what I thought the industry needed or what these decision makers wanted was incorrect. And from having hundreds of conversations and kind of asking the questions around how much would you pay for that, or would that be something willing to pay for, and how to figure out what they're willing to make money for. Is it saving their time? Is it helping them get a promotion? What are their individual goals, and figuring out how do we leverage that in order to help them, make a decision, and making sure that we're building a product that's needed.
Yeah, and so Rachel came to us and said, I'm not sure how to go forward. And we said, spend the summer, interview 40 customers, and come back and tell us what they tell you, and then make a decision. And that's what she did, and found a target market segment and found some validation for what she was doing. And so that may be one example that I'm just familiar with. I think it happens more frequently than we realize. Here's the extended point. If you're stuck, go talk to customers. I mean, it's the simplest thing, right? What surprises me is for all the brilliant people in entrepreneurship on every side of the equation, this idea of asking our customers what they want seems so foreign. Well, why? Why are we so afraid to talk to customers? Or why are we so committed that our idea is so right that we don't need to talk to customers? I mean, that sets you off on a path of potential failure. Unless you're Henry Ford or Steve Jobs, or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. Henry Ford's famous quote, if I asked my customers what they want, they would have told me faster horses, right? But there are only a few people like that in the world who have that vision. And even that is usually informed by, years and years of understanding customers. So I think that you just can't avoid it. Sooner or later in life, we have to talk to our customers, or they're going to start talking to us, either with their wallet, their legs, or their investment. Let me go to the next question from Lakshmi. First-time founder, how do you start those initial engagements with customers? Lakshmi, I'm assuming the question is, how do I even find them in the first place? And that's a really challenging thing to do, right? Especially now in sort of this COVID world where it's hard to just walk into people. But let me tell you how the National Science Foundation made us do it. We had 100 teams of scientists and business people show up at the National Science Foundation kickoff meeting. We each had proposed an idea and a product, and they gave us the Steve Blank pitch, similar to what I've talked about here, and said, go out, get out of the building, and just start interviewing people. And so we were in a biotech space, and there were a couple of other ventures from other universities in biotech space. So we just kept finding each other in hospitals all day long, knocking on doors, sitting in people's offices. I mean, it's literally as crude as that, right? You just have to start knocking on doors. But there are some shorter ways that we suggest to students because their time frame is even accelerated in the semester structure. Meetup.com, great place to find targeted people. Names, addresses, LinkedIn groups is a great way to reach out to people. Talking to people who you know in an industry and asking them who they might refer you to. Remember, the key is you don't want to talk to people you know, because your grandmother, your uncle, your fraternity brother, your sorority sister, your best friend is going to tell you, great idea, right? They want to make you feel good, not bad. They're not going to tell you that your baby is ugly. Right? So we have to find people we don't know. One other method that I've heard is to survey people first. Send out just get a mailing list from a publication or a conference that focuses on your industry. You can buy most of these lists. Send out a very simple 3 or 4 question survey. But the last question is, would you be interested in an interview? Would you be interested in allowing us to speak with you? And you'll get a small sample from that, but that's the place to start. And from there, you want to just capture everything that's said. There's a technique for interviewing called open-ended interviews, where we're not asking anything that would bias them. Do you like my product or not? Worst question you can ask, right? What does that tell you? But using a technique called open-ended interviewing, where we're asking, tell us about how you do your job. Tell us about what problems you encountered in your job. When was the last time you encountered that problem? Why? What are you using to solve that problem? Again, open-ended questions that enable them to share information with you. Let's see. Tom, when and how do you begin discussing your solution to your customers' problems? Tom, that's a really good question. One thing I could instill in all of us is if you've studied the scientific method in high school or college, that's what customer development is. It says we start with a hypothesis, we write it down, and we test it. And so the answer, Tom, is as soon as you think you're beginning to develop an idea, it becomes a hypothesis, not a solution, right? And I think that's the big distinction here. An idea in the early stages using the customer development methodology is simply hypothetical. You now have to go do experiments to test it. The experiments are customer interviews. or maybe observing customers in the workplace. But we take our idea, we write down as many as we can, we put them in that one of the boxes on the business model canvas I showed you, and we methodically test them through interviews. And we cross off the ones that are not validated, and the ones that survive, we keep working on and we keep working on. And those are what we call pivots. Let's see. Christina, I host focus groups on procrastination. Listen to how people describe their problem. Yeah, so Christina, you've used focus groups, and I think focus groups are a really good methodology. It's just, there's a cost to them most times. And for a startup, remember our dials, money and time are our big metrics, right? So it's usually, from a cost standpoint, more efficient for a startup to go out and find these people through meetups, through their networks, through LinkedIn groups, excuse me, and then begin to do that interview process. But if you are in a position to use a focus group, it's a really efficient way of getting people to market. The only thing I would say about focus group is the fact that they're convening somewhere may create a slight bias if they know where they're convening, right? And again, we want to interview people so there's no bias, so that they feel free to tell us we're wrong. Let's see, other questions. Yeah, I think I've burned you out of questions. This is one of the things that happens when you go from entrepreneur to professor. You start to talk a whole lot more and maybe think a whole lot less sometimes. So I'm happy to take any other questions. Let me actually, well, maybe perhaps we're on pause here. Let me go back. A lot of my conversation here has been about applying customer development, customer discovery. If you're interested in this and you haven't been exposed to it before, just search for Steve Blank. He developed the whole methodology. Well, he's a serial entrepreneur who has had enormous success, but he developed this out of the frustration of the original model I showed you. And he developed it for a graduate engineering class at Stanford. And he teaches it at Berkeley. And now he teaches it everywhere. He runs something for the defense industry called Hacking for Defense. He teaches it to the National Science Foundation. Virtually every university, every accelerator is using some form of his methodology. And so what that says to you as a founder, if you haven't encountered this yet, is there is an expectation that you've done this, right? The people who are making decisions about capital, about being on an advisory board, about your product, if many of them have been through this process, and there's an expectation that you come into the meeting knowing your customers. And the other thing I want you to think about is, think about the one thing that distinguishes you, that can distinguish you differently than anybody else. When you go raise capital, when you go pitch your idea, it's a deep knowledge of your customer. If you stand up at a pitch competition and say, we've interviewed over 100 customers in this segment, here's what they told us, and here's how that determined what we created. Everybody else in that room who hasn't interviewed 100 customers that market segment really has no, they're going to start talking about your pitch, that you went too fast, or your slides were this, the stupid kind of stuff that you get, as opposed to the data and the information. Excuse me. What comes after this customer discovery? Great question again, Tom. In my mind, it doesn't stop. Any business that isn't customers focused is not innovating, right? And so I think the business model, evolves into a business plan, into a more formal, structured business plan, where now we know our segment, we know our solution, we have a value proposition, and we're going to start making detailed forecasts about that. But once we go to market, we're going to keep getting feedback. So the customer discovery process never stops, because that's what innovative companies do. When we lose sight of the customer, we lose sight of our ability to compete. And if anybody's ever studied in B school, Clay Christensen's model for disruptive innovations, you'll see exactly what happens. As companies get more mature, they focused on their most profitable customers and they leave gaps at the bottom where startups come in and attack. And that may be another thing you might want to look at. Again, you can find this online. If you look at the disruptive innovation model, where's the place for you to begin to attack an entrenched competitor? It's at the bottom of the market where the big guys have forgotten about customers. Thanks, Lakshmi. CJAG, what is the best way to build the know, like, trust of your target customers? Again, it's like anything, you get to know them. So one of the things when you go into the National Science Foundation, into their National I-Corps program, you're given $50,000. And you're supposed to use that $50,000 to travel anywhere in the world to meet and interview customers. And so one other place, and Lakshmi, this would also answer your question earlier, is conferences. Right? You can be really efficient in talking to customers and looking at competition at industry conferences, trade shows, right? It's an efficient way to see a collection of people. And what you want to do is try and get aside with a few people and do some interviews. I do suggest that you treat your interviews as research, that it's not just casual, that what you're trying to do is find commonality, find consistency in answers, whether that's in favor of your product or leads you to a pivot, but you're looking for a reasonable sample size, like any research, that lets you make logical judgments.
We have a question from Russell around how might the ongoing pandemic influence this process?
Yeah, you went through it firsthand, Russell, in testing your product. It's eased up a little bit, I think. I think we've all become a little bit more familiar with Zoom. At the time when this first happened in March, everybody was just down. A lot of people hadn't used Zoom, were intimidated by Zoom, including probably 90% of the faculty in America. Or they were using Google Meet, or they were using Microsoft Teams. It was just sort of a fractured market. We've sort of pretty much aggregated around Zoom. And I think people are much more open now. The benefit is that we do have a little bit more time on our hands because we're not commuting. And we're not spending as much time perhaps in unnecessary meetings. And I think you'll find that people are more open than they were maybe 6-8 months ago. There are also conferences like this that have gone virtual, right? Which is a great place. So if you're interested in a particular market segment, it's easier than ever to participate in a conference. And the benefit is, both from the standpoint of using Zoom to interview people and go to conferences, is you can go to a conference that's in Silicon Valley or Zurich. You can talk to people who are in Silicon Valley or Zurich as part of your customer set, as part of your interview process, because we're all so much more accessible through this mode. Okay, so a couple questions about people stealing your idea. It's a great question, and it's one that comes up often, right? The question of an NDA. And I'll give you my answer. I think it's fairly consistent with what a lot of people would say who are in the industry. But if you have an unbelievably sensitive genomic model, or if you have to develop some incredibly sensitive part for an airplane, or you have an algorithm that no one has ever developed before, you should worry about protecting that intellectual property. But for 99% of us, that's just not the case. And so if I gave everybody on this call a question or a problem to solve, 45 people would respond to it 45 different ways. Each one would lead to a different business model. Venture capitalists will rarely sign a non-disclosure agreement. simply because they don't want to be liable if somebody comes along with the exact same idea or similar idea later on and have you sue them, right? And so this idea for most of us about protecting our ideas versus intellectual property, I think is one that we may put too much weight on. Again, if it's truly patentable or trademarkable, not trademark, but a trade secret type of intellectual property, be very, very careful. But if not, at some point you need to get feedback on your ideas, and you can't do that by holding it back. An idea that never gets to market is just an idea. We're trying to turn an idea into a business. And so we have to be open with that. And one of the great things is sharing your ideas with customers. They don't care about your product. I mean, here's the other great secret that we've discovered. Customers do not care about your product. Does anybody want to guess what they care about? Christina?
The result.
Their results. They care about their problem, right? We are all, that's just human nature. So if you solve my problem better than somebody else, fantastic, I love you. But if you stop doing that, or somebody comes along and does it better, I'm not going to use MySpace, I'm going to use Facebook, right? Or whatever, I'm not going to use a Toyota Prius, I'm going to switch to a Tesla, right? Solve my problem better than somebody else, that's all. There's no great loyalty in products if you're not solving humans' problems. And that's why this model is so important. We have to stay constantly vigilant about the problems of the segments that we're looking at. And another great question. If it's that sensitive, should we look at a patent or trademark first versus an NDA? Yes, I think. I'm not a lawyer, but I think if you have really sensitive technology, you want to be talking about patents or possibly a trademark early on. The nice thing is that with provisional patents, we've established sort of a stepped process that we can move to a provisional patent, which isn't as expensive at first, and then evolve to a full patent. But I guess the best answer I can give you, Anna, is I would talk to an intellectual property attorney or someone who deeply understands that, and they can give you some guidance as to how sensitive that is. The problem is it's so expensive, right? The legal fees to patent something, unless you're in a university where the university is going to, one, shoulder the cost of it, but also potentially take some equity in your company. It's just a difficult process, but definitely find out how patentable your idea is right off the bat, if you think it's that sensitive. Other questions? Just a few reference points, if there is a pause. If you're interested in learning more about design thinking, there's a couple really good books written. They're business books, not textbooks. One is written by Tim Brown, who's the former CEO of IDEO. The exact title of it is Design for Change. There's a great book written by the brothers David and Tom Kelly, who are the founders of IDEO. It's called Creative Confidence. It talks about how creativity is the essence of innovation. Innovation is the essence of business and competition, and how fearful we all are in this analytical world of being creative. So it's a great book on thinking in ways that drive innovation. Roger Martin, who's the former dean of the business school at the University of Toronto, has written a great book called Design for Business. Some of the models are a little outdated, but the approach, the context for business is brilliant and well done. Steve Blank has written a few books, but I think he would admit that they're not great books. They are more collections of notes. I would suggest subscribing to his blog. which is brilliant and historical. You can follow it from the day he started this. The Lean Startup by Eric Ries is an excellent book, which is built on the customer development model. Eric Ries was a student of Steve Blank's. He was an entrepreneur struggling with some of the issues we talked about. Took Steve Blank's class, actually asked him to invest in this company, and Blank said to him, "Take my class first." And Ries pivoted his whole career. He started writing the Lean Startup, running Lean Startup conferences. So Lean Startup is an excellent book. There's a lot of great resources out there. In fact, there's too many. So I would look at things by Tom and David Kelly, Tim Brown, Roger Martin on the design thinking side. Tina Seelig is another brilliant analyst in the area of design thinking. She teaches at the D School. She's a PhD in neuroscience, teaches at the D School. She studies creativity, and she also runs the Stanford Venture Accelerator. And then look at Steve Blank and Bob Dorff, who's his co-author, when you're looking at customer development. If anybody has questions, I'm sorry,
go
Rachel,
ahead.
go ahead. I was going to say, if anybody has questions or would like to talk further, my email is bellows@american.edu. I'd be more than happy to take your questions or get on a follow-up Zoom call and talk further if that would be useful to you. I just have to tell you, students come first, because we're in the middle of a virtual semester and we're all trying to figure that out. So I may be a day or two in responding, but be more than happy to talk further.
Thank you so much, Professor Bellows. We appreciate your time of coming on here and sharing your insights with the DC Startup Week community. Again, I could vouch for Professor Bellows as being extremely helpful and a huge resource for me as a mentor and advisor for my business. So definitely take him up on the offer at bellows@american.edu. You can also message him directly on the Attendify chat and find his information there. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for attending. Just a quick recap, we're at day 3. We have a jam-packed day of schedules. We're going into at 11 a.m. a founder side chat with Scott Case, as well as I believe, I'm blanking on the name, but the founder of Upturo. It's going to be an amazing chat and conversation where you're able to ask any of your burning questions that you have, followed by lunch and learns, followed by a day pack, and then we're closing today with a pitch competition as well as a virtual garage party. So it's going to be really fun and connection. So please go back into the schedule, drop on that. We encourage you to introduce yourself on the activity stream and follow through some of the to-dos that we put on this day to connect with the rest of the community. So with that, thank you so much, Professor Bellows. And I look forward to seeing everyone on the 11 a.m.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck with your ventures.